All right. Hello and welcome to the premiere episode of Dynamics of a podcast dedicated to Professor Moriarty, Napoleon of Crime and archnemesis of Sherlock Holmes. I'm Madeline Quiñones, and this is my co-host,
Dixie Parkinson.
And we're going to give you a rundown really quick of what we're going to be doing with this podcast. And we also ask for your patience because this is the first time we have ever hosted a podcast and we have no idea what we're doing. So today we're going to do just kind of an overview of the professor to get started. And in the future, we will be looking at different versions of Moriarty, including making a case for Basil Rathbone's 3 Moriartys being the same person and that person being a Time Lord. And at some point, we will talk about an actual Time Lord who started out life as the Moriarty to the Dr. Sherlock Holmes.
I wonder who that could be.
We'll also talk about different aspects of the professor's life, relationships, and academia, and other brothers named James. And for those, we're going to dig into fan theories. So when we do those episodes, we'll ask you to send us your own thoughts and theories, and we'll feature them on the show. At the end of the episode, we'll give you our contact info so you can do that. We're also going to try to get some guests on the show, and we've already got one volunteer. And we're looking forward to having him on. Last but not least, we are also going to do a walk through the whole canon. And I know, there are already multiple podcasts out there doing that. A new one even got started since I first had the idea, but we've got a different tack to take. We are going to try to take all 60 stories and tie them back to Moriarty. And if we can't, we'll talk about why we can't do that. But there's a potential connection to Moriarty in Sherlock Holmes' very first case, and there's a potential connection in his last. And I think that is going to be a lot of fun. Let's introduce ourselves and do the introductory questions, which we're going to ask anybody who is crazy enough to come on this podcast. So... all right, Dixie, you're up first. So the questions are, who was your first Moriarty? Who is your favorite Moriarty? And you can have more than one. Why do you love this character? And what is one canon story besides Final Problem / Empty House / Valley of Fear that you think Moriarty was definitely involved in? So who was your first Moriarty?
Okay, so my first Moriarty was actually Daniel Davis, the hologram Moriarty in Star Trek The Next Generation. So he appears in the episode Elementary Dear Daughter. And yeah, I knew nothing about the character when I first saw the episode, so it was an interesting introduction. Yeah, he's not entirely evil, so that also was weird. And yeah, but I ended up enjoying the character and being interested in learning more about him.
I think that probably, I feel like there are a few Moriartys who were firsts for, people who grew up in the 80s and 90s. And I feel like probably Daniel Davis was the first Moriarty for a lot of people around our age. I think that's quite possible. So then, who is your favorite Moriarty?
Okay, so my favorite would probably be Eric Porter from Granada. He's just such a great, so faithful to the original. He's exactly how you imagine the canon Moriarty to be. But I also like, I like Daniel Davis and I like Andrew Scott. Those are probably my top 3, but I haven't met a Moriarty I didn't like. I mean, there's the clone Moriarty from Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd century. That is Rattigan. All of them are good.
Yes. All right, so next question is, why do you love this character?
I think, I mean, you know this about me. I like villains, and I like villains that are like the equal and the opposite to the hero. Again, you know this. But yeah, I just find that very interesting because it gives you like another angle on the hero as well as the villains. You can see like what they would have been like if they'd gone down in a different direction. So like if Holmes had been evil, he probably would have ended up kind of like Moriarty. And I suppose you could say, well, if Moriarty had been good, what would he have been like? So yeah, I just find that interesting. And villains are just cool.
I think it's safe to say that Moriarty is a very cool villain in particular, for sure. Okay, so the hardest question is, what is one canon story besides Final Problem, Empty House, and Valley of Fear that you think Moriarty was definitely involved in?
Now, this is the one question I don't have a good answer to, especially as it's been a while since I've read the canon. I mean, I did just reread The Final Problem, which he's in, so I can't say that one. I don't.
You can say Red-Headed League. It's okay to say Red-Headed League and cheat.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, that's the obvious one. I don't know. Okay, I'll just say Red-Headed League. But I do love that Granada actually literally put him in that episode when he wasn't in originally. It's a great way to set up The Final Problem. And I mean, I think everyone who reads that is thinking that Moriarty is behind it.
Yeah, I think it's great. Anything else you want to add then in you're introducing yourself to everybody, or
I don't know.
I'll add something. You are an expert in the Master in Doctor Who, because you've read like literally what? You've read all of the Master's appearances?
Almost all. There are 2 stories that I think I haven't read, and then there are a few audios that I haven't gotten around to listening to, but like I've got a whole spreadsheet with every single story the Master has been in, and yeah, I've read, watched, or listened to most of them.
See, that's impressive. I don't think that most people can claim that. Even most diehard Doctor Who fans.
You might call it obsession.
I mean, no judgments here. We are in a fandom space. All right. So now it's my turn to answer these questions.
Who's your first Moriarty?
My first Moriarty was definitely Ratigan in The Great Mouse Detective, because I happen to know for a fact, I don't remember this, but I was like a toddler, apparently, the first time I watched The Great Mouse Detective. And I watched it several times throughout my childhood, and it, of course, always gave me nightmares because the stupid bat and then feral Ratigan at the end. It's like, holy cow, this movie is not kid friendly. But yeah, Vincent Price is great, and yeah, I was in my late teens when I finally found out that it was like also that it was Sherlock Holmes as mice, basically. My first human Moriarty, I actually genuinely don't know I don't remember anymore, because when I was getting into Sherlock Holmes, I found a couple of movies on YouTube that my mom had recommended to me that she'd watched during the 80s, which were Young Sherlock Holmes and the Frank Langella version of the William Gillette play. And I watched both of those right about the same time. So whether I met Langella's Moriarty first, or Professor Wraith first, I don't remember anymore. So there's also that.
So Ratigan it is.
Ratigan it is. So
now who's your favorite Moriarty?
I mean, favorite Moriarty is definitely Eric Porter for the reasons he gave. I rewatched Final Problem last week, and I was like, this is great because now I'm kind of like prepping for the podcast. And last time I watched Final Problem was last summer, so it hadn't even been that long, but just kind of like being in the zone of like I'm now thinking about what I'm gonna say on my new Moriarty podcast. I'm like, I'm actually blown away by how good he is, just like all over again. He was just absolutely amazing. And then of course I love Daniel Davis, because he is wonderful, and yeah, he's not 100% evil. I appreciate that he's well, this is Next Generation, so of course they would have a philosophical Moriarty.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that because, you know, Holmes is an amateur philosopher at times. So if Moriarty is his mirror, then it's fitting.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, when I reread The Final Problem this afternoon, one of the things I noticed is that in Holmes's description of Moriarty to Watson, he literally describes him as a philosopher.
That's right, he does, yeah. So it was nice seeing that with Daniel Davis's Moriarty. I think that they did a great job, and yeah, I wish there had been a better resolution for his character. And then my other favorite is Clone Moriarty, or Clone-iarty, as I've taken to calling him. Voiced by Richard Newman, I believe is the actor's name. And I think a big part of it actually is his voice actor, because he's wonderful. He's got like the perfect bad guy voice. And he's very sarcastic and funny. He's ironically, because of Daniel Davis, he's also a Trekkie, because he makes a Star Trek crack at one point, which I think you still haven't seen that episode.
Yeah, I remember you told me about this years ago, and I still haven't seen this episode.
You gotta
I need
watch
to get back to what I can't remember where I left off when I was watching, but I need to get back to that. We need to. I'm sure we'll be talking about him at some point in a future episode.
Yes, we definitely have to, because he's fantastic and he needs more love. So yeah, those are my top 3 Moriartys.
Nice.
Okay, so loving the character. Gosh, I've been trying to think of how to answer this without rambling, and I don't think that I can make this a non-rambling answer.
Just go for it.
Because falling in love with Moriarty as much as I did was kind of a journey, because I don't remember him leaving that deep an impression on me the first time I read the story. I was blitzing through the canon, and I was, you know, frankly more upset about, like, I think I kind of knew that Holmes survived, or I had an inkling that he did, but you know, I'm like, I'm more upset for him and Watson than I'm really thinking about Moriarty. And then, you know, eventually, it didn't take me that long to start writing fan fiction. And it always comes back to fan fiction, because fan fiction was actually how I got started on Sherlock Holmes in the first place. You know, I started writing Moriarty in my fan fiction, and there's no nuance to him at all. Like, he was just he was just this supremely evil person. And, you know, like Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars, there's nothing good to say about him.
Yeah.
And it's certainly fun to write that kind of character, but also that's not actually true to what we get of Moriarty in the canon. And I kind of realized that, and I realized that, you know, it's also not true to how people actually are in real life, as much as we hate to think about it. Nobody is actually ever that evil in real life, even though we kind of wish sometimes they were. And so I started focusing more on trying to figure out who he was as a person, and what his past was like, and how he came to be like a criminal kingpin. And and as I was going down that rabbit hole of writing him, that's how I really got to love the character and get obsessed over him. And yeah, so it was actually it was not about reading him or even seeing him, although I definitely loved Eric Porter right away. But it was actually about writing him that did it for me.
Nice. And now, what other story do you think Moriarty was definitely involved in?
A story that I think he was definitely involved in, actually, is The Resident Patient, which is a tale. Basically, the actual plot of it is that there are some criminals who have gotten out of jail, and they want to get revenge on their old teammate who ratted them out and got one of their other teammates killed. And the reason I think Moriarty's involved in this is because the teammate in question, Sutton, has changed his name to Blessington. He's like created a whole new life for himself. Like, they've got to find him, and you know, he's under a whole different identity. So it makes sense, even if Moriarty wasn't involved in the original Worthington bank case, which he actually could have been, because it's a bank robbery. The ex-convicts could have just like gone to him and be like, we want to find this guy, we want to get our revenge. And Moriarty's like, cool, I can totally do that for you. And I will plant somebody in the house to let you in. And yeah, I think it makes it. There are a couple more cases in the canon that are similar in terms of like there being somebody looking for somebody else who's under a new identity, and they want to get revenge. And actually the Valley of Fear basically goes along those lines. So that's why I think it's possible that Moriarty is also just in the business of finding people and directing the bad guys towards them. Like, have at it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Final introduction stuff. So I am on another podcast that I don't know how many people actually listen to it, but the Watsonian Weekly, put out by the John H. Watson Society. And since the start of the year, I have been doing the featured Watson of the week, and I still need to record my segment for this weekend. But yeah, and I gosh, I can't call it weekly anymore. I put out a web comic called The Adventures of Professor Moriarty, And
It's really cute. You should check it out.
and yeah, he shows up in our logo. So the little Moriarty with the heart eyes, that is part of the comic. So I need to get working on that again. But yeah, that's about it for my introduction of myself. Introduction for us. So now people know who we are. We are about halfway through the episode, and it is finally time to just talk about Moriarty. I was gonna read the bit in the final problem where Holmes is actually like telling Watson about him. So, of course, we have the thing that's gonna like forever tie people in knots over Watson knowing or not knowing about Moriarty. Because in the final problem in 1891, he apparently doesn't, and yet in the Valley of Fear, which takes place sometime before Watson gets married in presumably 1888, Watson does already know about him, and this is something that we can talk about at a later time.
Yeah.
Because that's definitely worth talking about. But okay, so I'm just gonna. Wow, this is actually quite long. Like I said, it's so good. All right. You have probably never heard of Professor Moriarty, said he. Never. I'm sorry, I can't read that without laughing. It's funny.
I was thinking that too when I was rereading it this afternoon. I was thinking, has he never heard of him?
Okay. There's the genius and wonder of the thing. The man pervades London and no one has heard of him. That's what puts him on a pinnacle in the records of crime. I tell you, Watson, in all seriousness, that if I could beat that man, if I could free society of him, I should feel that my own career had reached its summit, and I could be prepared to turn to some more placid line in life. Between ourselves, the recent cases in which I have been assistant to the royal family of Scandinavia and to the French Republic have left me in such a position that I could continue to live in the quiet fashion which is most congenial to me, and to concentrate my attention upon my chemical researches. But I could not rest, Watson. I could not sit quiet in my chair if I thought that such a man as Professor Moriarty were walking the streets of London unchallenged. His career has been an extraordinary one. He is a man of good birth and excellent education, endowed by nature with a phenomenal mathematical faculty. At the age of 21, he wrote a treatise upon the binomial theorem, which has a European vogue. On the strength of it, he won the mathematical chair at one of our smaller universities, and had, to all appearances, a most brilliant career before him. But the man had hereditary tendencies of the most diabolical kind. A criminal strain ran in his blood, which, instead of being modified, was increased and rendered infinitely more dangerous by his extraordinary mental powers. I'm going to stop right here and just be like exhausted at the genetic BS here. Because this just bothers me every time. It's like, apparently, and I have, shame to me, I have not read enough contemporary literature at the time, but apparently Irish antagonists were quite common. And, this whole like evil is genetic thing is an easy excuse for prejudice against the Irish or against people of color. And it's just like, oh my gosh. Anyway, let's get back to this. Dark rumors gathered around him in University Town, and eventually he was compelled to resign his chair and come down to London, where he set up as an army coach. I think that's where he met Moran.
That's another thing I was thinking when I was reading that. I was wondering, is that where they met? Does that make sense to me?
Yeah, I think it totally makes sense. So much is known to the world, but what I am telling you now is what I have myself discovered. As you are aware, Watson, there is no one who knows the criminal world of London so well as I do. For years, I have continually been conscious of some power behind the malefactor, some deep organizing power, which stands forever in the way of the law and throws its shield over the wrongdoer. Again and again, in cases of the most varying sorts, forgery cases, robberies, murders, I have felt the presence of this force, and I have deduced its action in many of those undiscovered crimes in which I have not been personally consulted. For years, I have endeavored to break through the veil which shrouded it, and at last the time came when I seized my thread and followed it until it led me, after 1,000 cunning windings, to ex-Professor Moriarty of mathematical celebrity. He is the Napoleon of crime, Watson. He is the organizer of half that is evil and of nearly all that is undetected in this great city. He is a genius, a philosopher, an abstract thinker. He has a brain of the first order. He sits motionless, like a spider in the center of its web, but that web has 1,000 radiations, and he knows well every quiver of them. He does little himself. He only plans. But his agents are numerous and splendidly organized. Is there a crime to be done, a paper to be abstracted, we will say, a house to be rifled, a man to be removed? The word is passed to the professor, the matter is organized and carried out. The agent may be caught. In that case, money is found for his bail or his defense. But the central power which uses the agent is never caught, never so much as suspected. This is the organization which I deduced, Watson, in which I devoted my whole energy to exposing and breaking up. But the professor was fenced round with safeguards so cunningly devised that, do what I could, it seemed impossible to get evidence which would convict in a court of law. You know my powers, my dear Watson. And yet, at the end of 3 months, I was forced to confess that I had at last met an antagonist who was my intellectual equal. My horror at his crimes was lost in my admiration at his skill. But he made a trip, only a little trip, but it was more than he could afford when I was so close upon him. Yeah, it's a brilliant introduction. It's like I once, in fact, I think Lindsay Fay has said this more than once, that like the final problem makes no sense, but that introduction to Moriarty is just so brilliantly written that you just buy it.
Yeah.
It just sounds so great. And it's like it does. And I mean, I could argue that you can make the final problem make enough sense if you start working on it, but he's great.
Yeah. I mean, as far as characters go, he was basically just created to kill off Sherlock Holmes.
Right.
And so he was just a plot device. But I think it speaks to how well Arthur Conan Doyle like wrote him and described him, that everyone who knows Sherlock Holmes knows who Moriarty is as well, even though he's just in that one story. Like he's endured after all this time as Sherlock Holmes' arch nemesis.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting too. Of course, I've been doing a lot of thinking in preparation for this first episode, and one of the things that I realized was that Moriarty is the one bad guy who is developed over the course of several stories. Like, we get a perfect introduction to him up front, but nevertheless, actually we don't even get his first name in the final problem. We actually get his brother.
Yeah, it's the same first name, but it's for a different Moriarty.
We get Colonel James Moriarty in the final problem, and then we get Professor James Moriarty in the empty house. But in the empty house, we learn something new about Moriarty, which is that he had a best friend. And I'm going to say best friend because, well, what Holmes actually says is bosom friend. But that's a little awkward to just say for casual use. So, but there's Colonel Sebastian Moran, who's his best friend, and suddenly, if you just had the final problem, like I was talking about earlier, you could write Moriarty as just like this purely evil person, but Empty House reveals that he has a best friend, and it's like, oh, now he has like a heart. He's a person. He's a proper person. And that's interesting and too often ignored. And then in Valley of Fear, you get a little more information about his organization. That's where you also get the bit about dynamics of an asteroid. And you find out that he's got a painting on his office wall behind his desk, and it's like it's like he shouldn't be able to afford it. The whole painting thing is interesting, and that's something, it's sometime we should talk about the influences for Moriarty, because there was a real life person who was called the Napoleon of Crime, and that was Adam Worth. And that's also where the painting thing comes from, the inspiration for the stolen, or presumably stolen, painting. He's the only Moran is the only other bad guy to be mentioned more than once, aside from Moriarty. But Moriarty is the only one to get developed over multiple stories.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting. There have been plenty of times that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are portrayed more or less very faithfully to the canon. But in terms of their characterization, and also in terms of physical appearance. And Moriarty hasn't been so much. There have been very few adaptations. For the most part, I think that people don't really care to have him looking the way that he's described in the stories. Offhand, I can only think of, Eric Porter looks the closest.
Yeah.
For sure. He looks like he stepped right out of the Paget illustration. The only other two that I can think of are Colin Jevons, of all people, and the Baker Street Boys, which actually preceded Granada. They made him up to resemble the illustration. And that was very.
I've seen any stills of that. I don't know what he looks like. That sounds interesting. I've got to look that up.
It's on YouTube.
Oh, okay.
And then the only other actor that I can think of is I don't know his name, but he's the Moriarty in the Soviet production in the 70s and 80s. He looks fairly like the illustrations, like a Russian version of the illustrations. Talking about actors who resemble Moriarty, there are very few. Very, very few.
Okay, so what are your thoughts on how accurate Daniel Davis is as Moriarty?
He doesn't have to be accurate in the first place because of what he is. But I think it's interesting though that he is himself a plot device. He's created by Geordi in the computer as a plot device. The original Moriarty is created to kill off Holmes, so he has to be his intellectual equal. And then holodeck Moriarty is created by the computer under Geordi's specifications to beat Data.
Yeah.
So it's a fantastic parallel.
I've never thought of that before.
Yeah. Since we see so little Moriarty in the first place, I think that you could make a case for him being accurate just because we don't see terribly much of him. Yeah, I had something in my head about like Moriarty being it like an archetype. Like if Holmes is the first superhero, then Moriarty is the first supervillain, and that's interesting.
I mean, he's definitely, I think, the template for a lot of villains in like fiction that have come after him. So
yeah,
obviously there's some who directly based on him, like the Master, but I think in general he's just, like you said, an archetype of supervillain, basically, of the archnemesis.
Yeah. So yeah, sorry to all our audience that this podcast was so disjointed. Like I said, we are totally new at this.
Yes.
And it's gonna be a learning curve. It's gonna be a learning curve. We are probably from here on out gonna have outlines typed up before the shows. We're not going all over the place. So yeah, the next episode, guys, we are going to talk about Moriarty's relationship, or lack thereof, however you want to go, with Sherlock Holmes. And we'd love to get your comments and feedback on that. So contact information. Of course, this video is going to be on YouTube, so you can comment on the YouTube video. You can also catch us on Twitter at Dynamics of a Pod. And our email, I'm very sure I have this right. Okay, yeah, I did get it right. Our email is dynamicsofapodcast@gmail.com. And we will have this in the show notes, because I know it's a little bit long. So yeah, that's how to get in touch with us. We also do have a WordPress, and of course I don't have it pulled up at the moment. Let me, it's on my other screen here. Dynamicsofapodcast.wordpress.com is our website. It's a very empty website so far, but we hope to have some stuff for you there in the future. And let us know, I guess, if you would like to see us on more social media, like if you think we should set up a Facebook page or an Instagram. I'm not sure how well podcasts do on Instagram. But yeah, just let us know what you think so far. Please be kind, and give us your thoughts for the next episode, please, and we will be happy to feature them. Anything else? Anything I'm missing?
No, I think that's it. I've had a great time discussing this with you, and I'm looking forward to more talk about Moriarty in the future.
Yeah, I mean,
never do it too much.
I mean, yeah, to just so our audience knows, I mean, we talk about Moriarty already like all the time, and I've always wanted to do my own podcast, but I never could think of like an original idea for it. And then I think I was starting to do my Moriarty comic in earnest, and that's when I think that's probably when it was like, oh, light bulb moment. We could actually do a podcast about Moriarty. Dixie will do it with me. Yeah. So that's how this whole thing got started. We just like to talk about this bad guy. So it's like, well, why not do a podcast about it? So yeah. I don't have a sign off. I was trying to think of a good sign off, and I can't think of anything. Well, thank you for listening. If you've made it this far, we love you. And we did talk about how often this podcast was gonna come out. Maybe we can try for bi-monthly. Let's just say no guarantees because life happens.
Yeah.
But I think we can try for bi-monthly. So thank you for watching and listening, and we hope to hear from you, and we will see you all hopefully soon. So bye. Thanks for listening.